independence. Ben Gurion declared Israeli independence, and the United States and the Soviet Union recognized it, and everybody else fell in line, and immediately international war started in this region, and the other Arab states got into the fight that was already happening between Palestinian villages and what's now called the Haganah, the Jewish army, and it became an international war. But the efforts of those Arab forces were, some of them were serious. Most countries didn't put too much of an effort into it. They lost bad. And by the end of the war, by the ceasefire, we have this middle map. And the state of Israel had expanded itself and had connected areas of the country. I don't know if this is working too well, pointing to. But you can see where they gained areas. And they expanded the connections between their different parts, and they got this corridor up to Jerusalem. And that's the 1949 maps that we sometimes call Israel of 48. Right? Even though the armistice line is 49. It's often called as the lands of 48. This created a large refugee problem for Palestinians, and this is still one of the outstanding issues in the conflict. About 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, and they ended up, as you see this other map here, Palestinian refugees, the orange circles are refugee camps. In Gaza, I need this to show you Gaza here, and in the West Bank, and in Lebanon, and in the East Bank of the Jordan River. These refugees, 750,000, the UN leased land and helped them set up refugee camps that have been under UN UNRWA authority since then. And they provide medical care, UN provides medical care, training, education, basic supplies for those who need them, and they've leased the land for them. It's privately held land by somebody else. Yeah. Well, nobody wants to be a refugee, right? There's a lot of scholarship on this issue, actually. People left, and villages had different experiences, right? There were some cases where trucks rolled in, and people were put onto trucks and loaded on them and moved into the West Bank, into the plains near Jenin. There were some cases where massacres had occurred, and villages fled, and the propaganda about those massacres, spread by the Zionist forces, actually, helped move people out. There was, in the Zionist archive, in the Israeli archive today, there's been a lot of study of it. There was clearly an intention to cleanse, what we call today ethnic cleansing, to move people out of areas, especially the coastal plains. So, war makes refugees, and a war happened, and these refugees were created, and it was intentional. It's quite clear at this point is intentional. There's a lot of when I was a kid, what I was told, right, was that Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who I showed you in a picture before, got on the radio and said, "Everybody get out! We're coming in to kill the Jews." So get out, and they didn't win, so everybody got out, and therefore it's Hajj Amin al-Husseini's fault. That's a really incomplete story, right? The birth of the Palestinian refugee problem by a journalist, now scholar, Benny Morris, Israeli, is probably the key book on this issue, who went through the archives when they were open 20 years ago.
Earlier you said something that really stuck out, and it's been sticking on my mind the whole time. You said that kind of the holding on to the pain of the past and creating a Zionist movement is almost what led to anti-Semitism. Could you say that's similar to what put people in these refugee camps, the fact that everyone wants to hold on to their nationalism, hold on to the past things that hurt them and this and that? Because you touched on that earlier, and I would like it's don't. What do you? I'm out of the league. I don't know what you do.
I'm not totally sure I got the question.
How does you said that Zionism contributed to anti-Semitism? How?
Well, I don't think I said that. I don't think I said that. I don't know. I think that this colonial experience, I think anti-Semitic images we can come to this later, but things that anti-Semitic images from Europe have entered, right, the Arab Middle East and are sometimes used in what is really an anti-colonial issue, right? But we'll get to that. I'll come back to that, right? It's a little bit complicated. Let me push forward a little bit with history. We'll come to modern times, and we'll deal with some images and anti-Semitism again, okay? I promise. And if I don't, you can ask me. All right, let me go back here. So, so the State of Israel is created in 1948. The remaining parts of Palestine, Gaza is under Egyptian control. It's occupied by Egypt. And the West Bank becomes under Jordanian control, Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And they actually annex it. So they make it part of Jordan, which means they give West Bank Palestinians Jordanian citizenship, right? It was kind of a second-class citizenship, but it was a passport. And it was better than being in Gaza, where the Egyptians did not give you citizenship. And they only had, it was a more difficult situation. But these are the borders from 1949, and the State of Israel, after the War of Independence, or what Palestinians call a Nakba, the catastrophe, the war, this was not the end. This was really, in some ways, the beginning. The guy I pictured here, Gamal Abdel Nasser, right? He was the president of Egypt. Now, he was an army officer who came to power through a coup, and they threw out the corrupt king of Egypt. Britain had come into Egypt in 1881. The British and the French were scrambling for Africa, right? 1881, they land in Alexandria. The king of Egypt is in some ways a kind of a puppet to the British during much of this period, and somewhat corrupt, and spends, and the deficit goes up, and under the name of saving their resources and deficit, the Egyptians, the British come in. Gamal Abdel Nasser throws the British out, and he is a hero of the anti-colonial movement. You got to remember, this is the 50s. After World War II, this is when anti-colonialism really started to grow across the whole world. In the United States, it was kind of like a civil rights movement, right? Black GIs came back from fighting World War II, told to sit in the back of the bus, and they said, hey, wait a second, we just fought against white supremacist Nazis, and now you're telling me to sit at the back of the bus, right? And that became a civil rights movement, an anti-white supremacist movement. In India, it's kind of the same thing. They said, we just fought this war against Nazis, and now you're telling us that we're not okay to rule ourselves. You're still going to be white supremacists in India. We want independence. Gandhi, right, said all that. In Vietnam, they wanted independence from the French. In Algeria, all over the world. And Egypt was part of that. And Gamal Abdel Nasser became an outspoken sort of hero of that anti-colonialism when he threw out the British, and when he said the Suez Canal, I keep setting this down when I'm needing it, right? The Suez Canal, right here, right, which connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, which means it connects Europe to the Indian Ocean, right? So like the Panama Canal, you can go through it without going all the way around South America. Suez Canal, you can go through it without going all the way around to Africa to get to India, for example, British colony of India. So this is built 1867, and the French and the British controlled it, and Nasser nationalized it and said, this is Egypt, and we're going to collect the tolls for the Suez Canal. And he took it, and the French and the British were really pissed off about that, and they got together with Israel, and Israel in 1956 invaded Egypt to take the Suez Canal back. And they, with the help of the French and the British, tripartite aggression it's called, or the War of 1956, and they took the Sinai, they took the Suez Canal, basically the United States under the UN said, you got to leave. You got to leave, because we got a bigger problem with the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and this is going to play right into the hands of the Soviet Union. So Israel has to withdraw from the Sinai, and the Suez has to return. We have to have a settlement. And so Israel, under that kind of international pressure, withdrew from Egypt, from the Sinai in 1957. But the antagonism and animosity existed. I'm skipping through history a bit. Nasser was the champion of the anti-colonial movement in the Arab world, and with a whole lot of troops, Egyptian troops, right here in the Sinai, in 1967, 10 years later, Israel made a surprise attack. Now, there are a lot of events that led up to that surprise attack, But Israel made a surprise attack in June 1967 and killed thousands of Egyptian troops on the ground and really struck a huge blow